Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of The Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at The Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters, and for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the SafeCamp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of SafeCamp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web or at SafeCamp Audio on social media. On today's episode, we talked to Marsha Levick, who in 1975 was among 4 people who founded the Juvenile Law Center, which is a Philadelphia-based organization that was the first nonprofit public interest law firm for children in this country. Levick stepped down as the organization's chief legal officer last year, though as she was quick to point out to me, she is still far from retired. So we talked about the experience of starting the first kid-focused law firm, the journey to 50 years that very few nonprofits make, and what's next for her. We also discussed changes to the way that the juvenile justice system operates, what makes a good amicus brief in Supreme Court cases, because Marsha has written more than probably anybody. And of course, we talked a little bit about the infamous Kids for Cash scandal in Pennsylvania, which Levick is as responsible as anybody for bringing to the surface. So without further ado, here is our conversation with Marsha Levick. We are joined today by Marsha Levick, who after 5 decades is stepping down as the chief legal officer at the Juvenile Law Center, which she helped establish 50 years ago, along with Judy Chomsky, Phil Margolis, and Bob Schwartz. Marsha, thanks for joining me again on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you for having me again.
You'll notice in that little wind-up intro of Marsha, I did not say she's retiring because she's not. She just filled me in on all the good things she's got planned. So maybe you tell the people that. So we're going to talk a lot about JLC and how it got started and the good old days, or the old days at least, of how this thing got off the ground. But what's the next chapter before we get into that?
So the next chapter in the immediate future is I'm going to be teaching at Temple Law School in the spring. I have a 1-semester appointment. I'll be serving as the Phyllis Beck Chair there. And I, in addition to teaching a juvenile justice seminar to 2nd and 3rd year law students, I'm also going to be teaching one section of 1st year law students constitutional law. And I think that is a really interesting subject to ponder in this moment as a lawyer. The Constitution I grew up with, that I learned about in law school 50 years ago and have been litigating under, it feels very fragile, feels like it's changing. So I'm thinking a lot about how I want to approach that class. I think it's incredibly important to teach to the moment that we're in, but I'm excited about that.
What do you hope to teach law students about juvenile justice? I'm sure the university reached out and wanted to have you. So do you get to create that, or are all the juvenile law, seminar courses around the country largely rooted in like how you lawyer technically in the court? Like, what are you going to make it?
So I think there's 2 different ways of approaching trying to teach law students something about the juvenile court system. And I want to add, I've been teaching that particular seminar actually for about 10 or 15 years at both Penn and Temple Law Schools in Philly with Jessica Fireman, who is taking over as chief legal officer at Juvenile Law Center. So Jessica and I, we teach it, and this is sort of very in the weeds law school stuff. I'm going to say it's a doctrinal course rather than a clinical course. And what I mean by that is we're not teaching law students how to represent kids in juvenile court. And there are programs in law schools, clinical programs, that are actually teaching law students, giving them an opportunity to go into court and represent individual youth. And they learn a lot about trial skills and what is involved in actually handling those kinds of cases. We don't do that part. What we do is really talk about the origins of the juvenile court in this country, which of course started 125 years ago, but also take them through almost kind of chronologically the stages of juvenile court, the very early years, This is sort of the quick snapshot of my seminar. The early years, which really take us through the 1960s, it wasn't until the 1960s that the Supreme Court, of course, recognized that kids had constitutional rights to counsel, cross-examination, all of the traditional criminal due process safeguards that we take for granted were not extended to kids until the 1960s. That was great. That was a huge step forward. In the 90s, we all lived through, I know you were with us then, we all lived through the super predator era, which upended, I think, the ability to really sustain the juvenile court as a place where children were treated, and it really pushed many more young people into the adult criminal justice system. So that's a phase that we look back on regrettably with some horror. An enormous amount of damage was done as a consequence of that. Of course, it turned out to be a myth, but we responded to it in the moment thinking that it was true. And then I think, thinking about the work of the last 20 years that Juvenile Law Center has been involved in, that I've been involved in, is really about adolescent development. And
So, I've never really thought about that, but like when you first heard somebody, talk about, or you read, John DiIulio's thing about super predators, you said we thought it was true. I think you were talking about the public in general, but like, what was your initial reaction to it? I mean, were you just like firmly, like that is crazy, or are you like, what is this guy? Is there merit to this? Like,
that's a great question, and I want to say I don't think initially we knew for sure that it was untrue. It was racist to its bones. It was about Black kids are going to terrorize us in our communities. But I think that it's not a bad thing that we tend to want to believe data, right? Mm-hmm. Like when we think about what's happening in the US today, where we literally don't know what is truth and what is not, because we're fed so many lies and so many misstatements and misrepresentations, you want to feel like there is something out there, there's something objective that you can hold on to. John DiIulio was a professor at Princeton at the time, I believe. He was supported by, I think it was James Fox, right, at Northeastern Law School, or a criminologist. And you have two people with significant academic credentials claiming they're relying on data and making some predictions, which everyone is responding to. So the Pennsylvania legislature, John, I don't think his first name was Ridge, whatever his name was, Governor Ridge in Pennsylvania.
Tom Ridge, yeah.
Yes. He convened a special session of our General Assembly here in 1996 to deal with crime, because in addition to what DiIulio was pushing out about young people, it is a fact. So this is something that we knew was true. Crime rose significantly across the U.S. in the late 80s and the early 90s among kids and among adults, driven by guns and driven by crack cocaine, largely in urban communities. And so we knew that part of it was accurate. Of course, the other thing that happens, data is always slow to catch up to the moment. Very hard to get real-time data. So we now know that crime started dropping in 94 and continued to drop every year till 2019, 2020, the pandemic. We didn't know that crime was dropping in 1994 and 5 and 6, I think, until 1997. I think back then that federal crime data was always 3 years behind, which made it incredibly difficult, right, to figure out what the policy responses were.
Yeah, we just actually had Trump's head of the Administration for Children and Families on, and he said a similar thing about child welfare data, which has gotten better also. And I think it's been more complete than the juvenile side for a long time. But he said, basically something that I'm paraphrasing here, but, if you're a director and you get good numbers, you pat yourself on the back unendingly. And if you get bad numbers, you say, well, those are old numbers. And it makes it hard to, but this is from his time as an Idaho director, not now, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I skipped ahead. You got to get people some favorites here. This is the house rules on our podcast. Movie, TV show, musical group, book, or sports team. I went back and looked at your last ones.
Yes, what did I say?
You were in a very COVID era mood. You recommended Station 11 as a TV show.
Oh my God. It's so funny. I was looking for a show that I had mentioned to someone yesterday that I couldn't remember the name of, and I tried looking through my continue watching line on my TV, and Station 11 popped up, and I was like, it was an amazing show.
Sure.
However, it's very well, it's dark. It has its optimism at the end, but it's pretty dark. Okay, what else did I say? Did I say anything
Did
about?
Station 11, and you did Wish You Were Here as a book. So
Oh,
you can go
those were
back to
COVID
those, or
books. They were COVID books.
yeah,
I have a lot of favorite books. I continue to read a lot of fiction. I read not so much nonfiction. I feel like it's homework or it's what I do.
yeah.
Oh, I'm all about fiction. One book that I read that I love that everybody else loved, it's not this year's best, but All the Colors of the Dark.
Okay.
Fabulous, fabulous book. I just recently read a book called The Correspondent, which is also being
Heard that was
highly praised. I started it and I thought, am I going to stay with this? And I did, and it was incredibly satisfying. A wonderful book. And then on the really super light side, anything by Emily Henry, which are just rom-coms in a book.
You're one of the most Philly people I know. You must have at least one sports team that you pull hard
Well,
for.
I am, of course, a fan of the Phillies and the Eagles. I love it when they do really well. Do I go to any games or watch them regularly? No. But I'm rooting for them all the time.
Got it. That was Bob's job, I guess. Bob Schwartzer. He rests
Yes.
in peace. One of Marsha's colleagues and co-founders. He must have gone to how many games did he go to a year? He
In
was
his
a-
heyday, he had one of those packages. It wasn't never a season, but maybe 30 games a season. Yes. And I want to share the thing that Bob taught me about baseball. Bob was a part-time umpire. You probably knew that, John.
Didn't know that. That's
Did
amazing.
not know that.
Like
Okay.
Little League.
He was a part-time semi-pro ball and softball umpire. And he was also a basketball referee. Started doing that in college and continued it a bit after we started Juvenile Law Center, and it fell away. But he was very knowledgeable about baseball. And I remember going to a game with him once and him telling me that, when you sort of watch the, safer out call at a base, often needs to be looked at carefully by the reviewers now. You're kind of like, how do they know whether the guy was safe or not? It seems so close. And what Bob told me was that they listened for the sound. They watched the foot or the hand hitting the base
Yeah,
and listened to the sound of the ball in the glove.
that makes total sense.
So Bob taught me that.
Oh, yeah.
I am forever grateful.
So let's go back before you even met Bob. What's the most trouble pre-18-year-old Marsha Levick ever got in? What's your personal experience, if any, with
I was not a bad child. I was a good child. I don't even have anything to confess.
what's like the first you were even aware that this exists?
Oh my
Get
God.
arrested when you're a kid, like any of that?
No. I mean, look, I grew up in a largely white middle class neighborhood in the 50s and 60s. And when I was 12 years old, my family moved into an apartment building in downtown Philadelphia. So I had a very urban teenage adolescent experience. I went to a Quaker private school from 8th grade through 12th grade. So my world was small and pretty insular. When I would tell people I would meet who I didn't go to school with, I go to this French school, you would often get the response of, oh, you go to a prep school. Because the French school that I went to was located right kind of in the heart of downtown Philadelphia, it actually had a very eclectic student body and it drew kids from all around Philly. It was not like a downtown Philly school. So I do think that for a very small school, my class was 35 students. The entire school, K through 12, was 500. It was actually extremely diverse, far more diverse than the community that I grew up in before I started going to school there. But it was what it was. I was in a happy, protected, middle-class environment.
Sure. So how do you come to be exposed to all these issues? You went to UPenn, then you went to Temple. Have you ever left Philadelphia in your entire life? Like you must-
Yes. Yes. God, that sounds terrible. This girl cannot get out of her house. Yes. So first of all, I started at Northwestern and then transferred to Penn and did get my bachelor's degree from Penn. I also, you might remember this from prior conversations we've had, I did leave Juvenile Law Center in 1982 and did not come back until 1995. And for 6 of those years, 1982 to 1988, I was working in New York the big city, working for the now Legal Defense and Education Fund, which people now know as Legal Momentum. And I was doing national women's rights work. So it wasn't all kids all the time.
Okay. So question still stands though. Like, I'm just interested in your origin with this work. Like, did you get
Yeah.
an internship at college? Like, how did you first hear about juvenile justice and child welfare?
Yeah. So context and time always matter, I think, for a lot of the decisions that we make in life. I grew up in the 60s and 70s. I was in law school in the early 70s and in high school in a Quaker school that was all in on war resistance, obviously during the Vietnam War in those years. And so I was exposed to and encouraged to think a lot about and participate in the social and political upheaval of those times. And as I went through law school, what I realized I wanted to do was I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. And I say this today, we said it 50 years ago. I think it's still how I think about ideally. Maybe it's more of an idealistic view now. We really thought that the law was a tool for social change. And that as lawyers, if we chose to do civil rights work, we could make the world a better place. And Bob and I, and Judy and Phil, who were all in law school together, shared this desire to create something that would allow us to be some kind of civil rights lawyer. And I use that term because I think I've always really thought of myself as a civil rights lawyer for children. I think that's what Juvenile Law Center does. We decided to identify kids as our group, as the kids that we wanted to advocate on behalf of, because we didn't know a lot, right? Remember, we did this out of law school, so we kind of knew nothing. Important to note that. But we did know that the idea of kids having legal rights was very new. We knew that the Supreme Court 7 years earlier had said, oh yeah, kids are people too under the Constitution. So it was almost a non-field. It was a field that we could enter with very little scrutiny, again, because it wasn't like there were thousands of people across the country doing the same work. There were very few people doing the same work. And I think we had the opportunity to participate in building that field, which is kind of amazing.
Totally. Was there like a true just day one where you guys, you're at the cafeteria or at a college bar and just, hash this out over like cocktail napkins, or how did it like?
Well, if you know Bob, he did not drink at all.
So you don't have to drink at a bar.
Probably not at a bar.
Yeah.
These are the kinds of questions for your audience. Bob died last fall, over a year ago, and I still have questions for him. And one of my questions would be, so what exactly was the thing that got us all going? Because Bob would remember that. I remember meetings not in a bar or cafeteria, but meetings in the kitchen of Judy Chomsky's house, sitting around the kitchen table, hashing out what our plan was and what we were going to do.
I don't know Judy or Phil at all. Can you tell me a little bit about them?
Sure. Judy was 10 years older than us in law school. I mentioned that because she thankfully was married to someone who was fully involved in his career, meaning he was a cardiologist and he had a doctor's office. And that was where our first office was, in his doctor's office that he used only 2 mornings a week to do insurance physicals, which is, I guess, something doctors did back then, 50 years ago, kind of a sideline, because he was trained as a cardiologist. So for the 3, I guess, total of 4 days outside of his 2 mornings a week, that was our office for the first year. So it was rent-free. It was bizarre. There was a waiting room, a private office, and an examination room with an examination table on it, which I don't believe we used during the course of that year. But it's a great origin story, right? It's true. That's our origin story. And Judy left Juvenile Law Center, I think around the same time that I did. Judy was deeply involved in the anti-war movement in Philadelphia, had always been involved in really progressive politics, and has continued to this day to be involved in labor law here in Philly. Phil actually came to Philly from Chicago and came to Temple Law School from Chicago, and was also someone who just was really interested in participating in the social and political unrest of the times, really embraced this idea of being a civil rights lawyer. but he was also a vegetarian and left Juvenile Law Center early, maybe after 3 or 4 years, and went into the health food business. So
Really?
yes, never practiced law again.
So, like you said, you go into something out of college, you got the fire in you, you got the energy, you're young. Probably, I'm guessing, have no idea how to run a nonprofit, start a nonprofit, all that stuff. What was that experience like, and how did you even get funded?
So again, you have to remember we knew nothing. So I think knowing nothing benefited us because we had no idea what the challenges or obstacles were. And so when we started Juvenile Law Center in the fall of 1975, each of us had another job. So Bob was doing his refereeing, in the winter season. He would do basketball. He did some probably umpiring over the summer. And in the spring, I was working part time for a law firm that I had worked for while I was in law school. Judy had less financial concerns because her husband was gainfully employed. And I think that Phil had worked during his summers for the EEOC in Philly, and it is possible that he might have continued as a doing some part-time work for them. The very first grant we ever got, which is ironic, was from the federal government. It was from the old Law Enforcement Assistance Administration,
Wow.
which was the precursor to all the DOJ funding streams today. And I don't remember exactly what the grant was for, but it had to be for advocacy. I mean, that's what we were. We were four lawyers who set up this public interest law firm, nonprofit public interest law firm, to do advocacy on behalf of kids. So certainly the money had to be somehow connected to that kind of work. I think it was, at most, it was a couple-year grant. I know it was at least a 1-year grant. We then began to figure out the foundation game and were able to tap into initially local foundations. Over time, of course, in a much better position to tap into big national foundations as the scope of our work expanded. So we learned it as we went.
That's always been an interesting thing about Juvenile Law Center to me, is like that you guys kind of maintain that duality between like a local operator and a national operator without it never seemed weird to me or like it felt weird to you guys.
I think what you have to learn, and I've seen this with some other advocacy organizations, you can't fully do direct representation and systemic work because the direct representation just sucks up the time. On the child welfare side, the cases go on for years. If you pick up child welfare cases when kids, even if they're not infants, if they're young, sadly, it takes a long time for those cases to unwind, hopefully in some positive way. Delinquency cases tend to be much shorter. They hopefully don't go on for years and years, but they're just incredibly time consuming in terms of the amount of hours you have in a day to do that work. So what Juvenile Law Center did do very intentionally, I would say by the 90s, we made this decision and this is a term that Bob Schwartz always used, was to go wholesale rather than retail. And that we saw, we could continue to try to improve one life at a time, to defend effectively one child at a time, or we could take that knowledge that we learned from being in the trenches, the awareness of the ways in which the system breaks down and doesn't serve children, often hurts children, and turn it into a different kind of advocacy that was focused on trying to advocate on behalf of hundreds or thousands of kids through litigation, through policy work. And that's really been the model that Juvenile Law Center has stuck to, I would say, certainly for the last probably 25 or 30 years.
I looked up some research around like what the life cycle of nonprofits is. 50. So, take this for what it's worth. This is one study, but that estimated that only like 15 to 20% make it 50 years, which I got to say, actually I thought it would be lower.
That's not a bad number.
I thought it would be lower. And that same paper, interestingly, I guess this kind of it makes a lot of sense, but it's sort of like basically broke nonprofit life cycles into 3 groups. It's the startup phase, the founder transition, and then the most interesting one is the relevance gap. So, and they basically said by your 50th year, you need to have adapted to the time and have like reestablished your relevance to society in a big way. Which is it, how does that resonate with you, having been along for that whole?
Yeah, I
feel
think
like it's safe to say you guys are in the not. I'm not saying you're not relevant, but that would be the phase you're in. You've already done the transition.
So first of all, happy to be in the 15 to 20% that made it to 50. I don't know how many make it to 75, but hopefully we'll be in that group. There's a weird thing when you're an advocacy organization. Part of you is like, I don't want to be here 25 years from now because you want to have solved the problems.
Right.
Not optimistic. I think that, one of the things thinking about the founders phase and how the founder moves on and then what happens, we've kind of had two phases of that because, of course, Bob retired 10 years ago. Bob left the organization in 2015, and Sue Mangold came on as our first non-founding executive director, CEO. And I think some people were surprised. I don't think I was, and I was happy about the outcome. A pretty seamless transition, as it turns out. Now, it's possible because the other founder, was still here, that made the transition easier. I don't know. I want to give credit to Sue as someone who stepped in very big shoes, certainly to fill Bob's shoes. And for 10 years, because we now have another transition, for 10 years, I think did all she needed to do to keep the organization financially stable, moving forward. And also, as every year, every 5 years, every decade is a different moment. And this is the relevancy question, of course. You need to stay relevant. And Sue provided the kind of leadership that was essential to trying to make that happen. Today, so we're in another transition. Last founder, that's me, last one standing, moving on from Juvenile Law Center and passing the torch to Rhea and Jessica, both amazing, brilliant lawyers who've also both been here for almost 20 years. So they are not new to the organization. Sue was new. Sue had worked here at Juvenile Law Center for a few years in the 80s and then went off and had a 20-year career in academia. But Jessica and Rhea have been here. The organization is now in their bones. So I am excited and optimistic about the future. And I'm not worried about Juvenile Law Center staying relevant at all. I think that we are in good hands.
Going back to kind of the origin for one more second, it kind of struck me that, there was another organization that had their 50th anniversary this year, and that was Youth Advocate Programs, which they held their event in Philadelphia. They're a Harrisburg, Pennsylvania organization. And I think it to me from the outside, it seems like not a coincidence that both of you got your trajectory going at the time they did and persevered after the passage of what really, by and large, is still the only federal law about juvenile justice. So was there something about that law that gave you wind in the sails? And was there something in Pennsylvania that made it a good incubator for organizations like you guys?
So you're talking, of course, about JJDPA, Juvenile Justice and Juvenile Prevention Act. And so, it was passed in 1974, a year before we actually opened our doors as Juvenile Law Center. The thing that was going on, so JJDPA was passed. It was obviously the carrot and stick classic funding strategy. If you do this, we'll give you money. And it had some core mandates that states had to agree to implement or abide by, including getting kids out of adult jails. That was a big piece of what JJDPA was concerned with in the 1970s. And that was an issue in Pennsylvania. And so there were actually inside and outside groups that put energy and resources and time into getting kids out of a particular prison in Harrisburg called Camp Hill, which was one of the state correctional institutions run by the state, which apparently at that time housed a number of young people under the age of 18. And so I think YAP was involved in that. We were involved with that. Some colleagues from Massachusetts, Jerry Miller, who had done a lot of work in Massachusetts back then, particularly in deinstitutionalizing the system up there. We participated in that. Brand new Juvenile Law Center, again, who knew nothing. We participated in this effort to ensure that particular mandate was being abided by in Pennsylvania. And it may just be that what it provided was a kind of statewide, some connective tissue, right? Like we were based in Philly. In the early years, we were serving Philly and the surrounding counties, Montgomery County, Delaware County, Chester County. We did not think of ourselves as a statewide organization. We did it in the 80s, initially very local, but that work was something that we thought we needed to be a part of, along with, as it turns out, other advocacy organizations or advocates involved in it. So, great question. And it may be that that was some of the kind of glue that held things together and then kind of spurred this work going forward.
Was there any point along this ride where you felt like there was an existential sort of existence moment for Juvenile Law Center? And if so, like, how did you guys get past it?
So I wasn't present for it, but I know what the moment was. As I said, I left in 1982. I went to work for the Now Legal Defense Fund, doing women's rights work in New York for 6 years. And when I left there in 88, I actually went to work for a small boutique litigation firm doing commercial litigation. I came back to Juvenile Law Center in 95. But what I know from Bob, and he's told this story many times, is that I think in 1990, Juvenile Law Center was literally down to measuring the amount of money in its bank with just 3 digits. And I think that was a moment where Bob was struggling with, can we hold this together? Some grant came through, I think, from a large national foundation. And he would always say, and we've never missed a pay period since. And yeah, I mean, I came back in 1995. The funding was stable. The funding has remained very stable since then. I mean, there's always ups and downs with any nonprofit. You don't bring in the same amount of money every year, and some years are harder than others. But we're still here. Right now, we have a staff of, I think, about 20. We've been as high as a little bit over 30. I think that's a number that is hard to sustain in this philanthropic community. I think we're at a good number right now. But yeah, I think Bob would say that was the moment, do or die.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code podcast10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code podcast10 today.
I think you are probably the person whose name I come across randomly the most when I'm looking at like history and historical documents. For example, last week, I don't even know why I got on it, but I was looking into the history around like the Social Security benefits issue for foster youth. And I'm looking at, Washington v. Keffler, and there's Marsha Levick, amicus, right?
There I was.
So how do you know how many amicus briefs you've either written yourself or co-authored?
I don't know. I never counted. It's obviously dozens. What I will say with some pride is that one of the things that I think Juvenile Law Center, and this work is all work I did on behalf of Juvenile Law Center through Juvenile Law Center, is that increasingly with time, as listservs have become more prominent and someone poses a question on a listserv that we are all a part of, I'm dealing with this issue. Has anybody ever thought about it? Invariably, Juvenile Law Center has written an amicus brief on it. Or we might have written a scholarly article on it, because I think one of the other things that I'm very proud of about the staff at Juvenile Law Center is that we're lawyers, but we're also scholars. We have a very, very robust publication record in this office of publishing in many law reviews across the country. And I think that's amazing to be participating in that space as well and conversing in that space. So yeah, we've been everywhere, and I think that's great.
What goes into writing an amicus brief? I mean, that's, for us non-lawyers, I don't even know where you begin. What's that process?
I think the most important thing that I would say about doing an amicus brief is that you want to add something to the conversation before the court. The parties, if they're doing their jobs well, will hopefully make the best arguments that they need to make to win for their client or for whatever interest they're representing. As an amicus in these cases, we understand that the court values those briefs when we introduce a new concept, a related concept, something for them to think about that might inform how they ultimately decide the legal issue before them. So I can give you a couple of examples that I think illustrate that. One is that early on in the sentencing cases, the issues before the Supreme Court in Roper and Graham and Miller were just very, very specifically, does the death penalty or does life without parole violate the cruel and unusual punishments clause of the Eighth Amendment? And the court has a formula for how it sorts that out by looking at what states have done. Do states generally permit it, prohibit it? How does it comport with criminal justice goals? But those cases were aided enormously by amicus briefs from Juvenile Law Center, as well as other medical groups that really talked about the developmental science. Initially, just really the social science, as we got into Graham and Miller to talk more about the neuroscience. So the court had that framework of research to inform their legal decision, which was incredibly important because in Roper and Graham and Miller, that research had never been presented in the trial courts, in the proceedings leading up to the case getting to the Supreme Court. So that's one example where it made a huge difference. Another example is in the area of race. So sometimes a case may be before an appellate court, federal court, state court. The court is being asked to decide a particular issue, perhaps about a Fourth Amendment issue around search and seizure. It could again be a punishments issue, could be a transfer issue, how certain laws require that certain children be tried as adults, without understanding that it turns out that the way that law was drafted, it's almost all children of color who are caught up in that particular process or that search or whatever it is. And that is often not brought out by the parties, by the lawyers for the individual, but amicus briefs can be very helpful in giving the court that context. Like, as you're deciding whether this is constitutional, you should know who's being affected by this.
And so I would imagine when you say that, that a lot of times it's not brought out in the arguments tactically.
Yes. Yes.
On the best.
Yes.
So
exactly.
There's a risk of that in an amicus. You're not worried about ticking off some judge that doesn't want to make his decision about race.
Exactly. And there will be other arguments like that where, for one reason or another, counsel for the individual is not going to make that argument, but we can make it without any concerns. The last example I'll give you is international law. So in Roper, the decision striking down the death penalty, there were amicus briefs submitted by foreign bar associations. I think the Bar Association of England and Wales submitted an amicus. I think there was an amicus submitted by a group of international lawyers to educate the U.S. Supreme Court that the U.S. was pretty much the only country in the world that subjected children to the death penalty as a sentence. That mattered to Kennedy. Kennedy was someone who had already demonstrated that he actually cared what international norms were around some of these issues. And we see it now again. We're participating in a case before the Michigan Supreme Court, where the court under its own state constitution is looking at some sentencing issues. And we're going to be sharing with that court, this is what happens around the world in this same space on this same question. Yeah. Because I think that we live in a global universe, right? The world gets smaller every day. The boundaries are blurred. And I think but I think there are judges in state and federal courts who actually care about what the rest of the world is doing and can learn from that.
Does one of the dozens you've written or participated in stick out to you in the sense of how much weight it carried? I guess you would measure that by, certainly if you hear an opinion, if you see like a majority opinion and it's like, I wrote that,
We definitely have had some of our briefs cited in many appellate court opinions, lots of state court opinions. I think we've gotten some references in U.S. Supreme Court opinions. I'll tell you the brief that we wrote that was the most fun to write.
Please.
Yes. So we
most fun brief to write.
We were in amicus
Yeah.
in a case before the U.S. Supreme Court involving an adult who was, I think had been sentenced to death. And it's a case out of Texas, and he was appealing his death sentence. And the basis for the appeal was that as death penalty jurisprudence has evolved before the U.S. Supreme Court in the last 50 years, basically, the one thing that the court so far has consistently done is really said that anything that is mitigating, anything that can provide a jury or a judge with a reason to step back from the death penalty has to be presented. If you don't present everything that can be presented, or if a court doesn't allow everything to be presented, that is actually an error that can be the basis for an appeal. And so the issue in this case, as best I remember, it had something to do with kind of the trauma of childhood and adolescence not having been sufficiently presented of this particular individual in his sentencing before the court. And so we wrote what we all at Juvenile Law Center call the Buffy brief. It was written over the summer, and we had several interns that summer who spent hours watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which apparently had a number of wonderful references in various segments about the trauma of childhood and adolescence. And then we pulled in some other examples from other kinds of literature, whether it was movies or novels. I don't remember it all now. But yes, it was the Buffy brief, and it was great. It was a lot of fun to write.
That's really funny. That was one of the biggest cult classics. I used to, our origin story of Fostering Media Connection.
Yes,
we got our start. I was bartending and managing events and hosting trivia because I was making no money doing this. In our trivia game, we used to let the third place team pick the category. And so many teams picked Buffy the Vampire Slayer that I had to basically say, like, it's banned. It's over. We've done it like
no
5
more
times in like 5 years.
Yes.
You mentioned the big sentencing cases, right? Those are the ones that stand out from that run. I always feel like it gets short shrift. JDB versus North Carolina, which kind of was around the same time and was like a big deal. I just remember thinking, it was a big deal. Like, can you question a kid in school? It probably happens a ton of times. What's your sense of like the impact that's made? Is it being lived up to? Like, I always wonder about that case.
I'm so grateful for the question, and I didn't even plant it.
Did not plant it. We did not talk about this.
But I love it because Jessica and I, who worked on that case very closely, and we worked on it at the state level. We supported JDB in the North Carolina Supreme Court, where he lost, supported the cert petition, and then filed an amicus brief on the merits. Yes, JDB, to me, is the most important case of all the cases.
Wow.
The reason being that it has the potential to have the greatest impact. The sentencing cases were only about children who were being prosecuted in the criminal justice system. And whatever lines the Supreme Court drew about what was a permissible sentence or what was too extreme, even for the U.S., the leaders in punishment, those lines only benefited children in the adult criminal justice system. It has nothing to do with what happens in the juvenile justice system. JDB does. JDB is all about kids in juvenile court. It was the first case ever in American legal history to recognize the idea of the reasonable child in criminal law, which had and has the potential to still have significant implications for self-defense and duress and reasonable force and many kinds of issues that arise in the context of criminal proceedings that should be unique to children now that we have this concept of the reasonable child.
We should, just for context for people that don't know JDP versus
yes,
off the top. This was a child. It was a kid who was questioned in school, and it was really around the question of, did he feel like he could have walked out of that?
Correct. Yes. So this is a Miranda case, and everybody knows Miranda because they all watched at least one episode of Law and Order. And
in my case, 4,000.
Yes. Yeah. And in the American legal system, Miranda is when you get warnings about your right to counsel and your right to remain silent and other things. And police are required to give you those warnings if they are treating you as a suspect in custody, meaning that they really have their eyes on you. Yeah. And JDB was a 13-year-old who was interrogated at his school by law enforcement, by a police officer, and was pushed to confess to his involvement in some very petty crimes in his neighborhood. And after he said, yes, I did it, after being told by his vice principal, you really should tell the truth here, it'll be better for you, and had no other adult or lawyer advising him of the risks of confessing, he confesses, and then he is Mirandized. Then they tell him what all of his rights are. And of course, he's 13 years old, and he probably doesn't understand them anyway. So when the case goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court, the question before the court is, should we think differently about that magical moment when law enforcement has to tell someone what their Miranda rights are if the person is a child? And the court said yes. And the reason they said yes is because they acknowledge that a 13-year-old or any teenager, they can't walk out of their classroom in school without raising their hand and asking for some colored slip. Imagine them in a closed-door conference room with a uniformed police officer and other adults in this space with them. They're just not going to say, okay, so I'm going to leave now.
Yeah.
So really, it's more the idea that kids are always going to feel like they can't get up and leave. They're always going to feel like they are constrained by the authority figures around them. And that's why the case is so important, because the Supreme Court is recognizing, in the context of a juvenile court matter, that kids are different.
Yeah. By and large, the cases, the situations that define juvenile justice history and change are the ones that end up as Supreme Court cases. You know, they're not really famous cases. The Supreme Court case is famous. Is it fair to say that Kids for Cash is the only one not in that lane? Like, I was trying to think of other juvenile justice cases that I'm aware of over time that actually, had this profound public, impact or mark on things. I think it's the only one. But you're a much better gauge of history. Can you think of any others?
Yeah.
I should say before Marsha gets going here, we're not going to spend a lot of time in preamble setting up what Kids for Cash is. I did a whole interview with her on it, and I did a whole story on it, and a million other reporters did. So I'll just link to people that want to read more. But go ahead.
What Kids for Cash really had going for it was the kind of captivating notion of judges receiving nearly $3 million in monies. We call them kickbacks. They were never accused of accepting kickbacks, but they took money from someone who owned a private correctional facility, from a developer who built it. They did not report it. So these were funds that they held in secret. They didn't report it to judicial authorities, to state tax authorities, to federal tax authorities. They hid the money. They took it in secret. They kept it in secret. They spent it in secret. And it captivated the world. So, John, you wrote about it, and so did 100 other people, right? Maybe that's even a low number. It really had an international lens on it. And there are not a lot of stories out there, even today, that have that much interest. And so the case, while it was about a very extreme form of greed and corruption, it involved kids. So you had judges who violated the public trust in being responsible for what happened to these children and when they came before them. took money to enhance themselves that harmed the children who came before them, that subjected them to significant periods of incarceration. It's a great story in a horrible way. And I think that's why it had so much traction. And I think it still has traction today.
Oh yeah, I think that that's absolutely true. And I think that's what I was trying to get at is, if you can imagine it positioned among these most infamous and important cases in history, with respect to juvenile justice, what's like to you the 1-2 sentence answer for why it's historic? You've covered why it's sexy and why it got so much attention. But what is the living legacy of this in the context of, history?
I think that for me, for those of us who represented the kids and who were in the case, not because of the money, we didn't know about the money initially, but because of the really extreme violation of kids' rights. You had more than half the kids who went before one of the judges were essentially denied their right to counsel. They all appeared without lawyers and had very perfunctory hearings. It did not bear any of the traditional earmarks of a due process hearing, were essentially railroaded into pleading guilty, and they paid significant consequences for that. So to me, the case is a reminder 40 years after, let's remember the timing, 40 years after the Supreme Court said kids had a right to counsel under the Constitution. 40 years later in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, you had a judge who was pretending that case had never existed. And so I think the case stands for really the sanctity of due process rights for kids, and that matters.
Yeah. I think we've talked about this in the past, but I think I'll always remember most, and it's weird. I interviewed a lot of different people about a lot of different things there. Certainly the thing that, I'll credit you and Juvenile Law Center on is nobody really seemed to care all that much until the money part.
Correct.
And you guys were in there. I think the thing that kind of quickly surfaces, you got a little data out of Luzerne for our story is this guy, his name is Mark Chivarella. He was filling up juvenile detention centers with kids that didn't need to be there well before he had some public or secret financial incentive to do so. But it's not that. It's, to me, the thing that just like always sticks is like I remember interviewing the editor of like the Mountaintop Eagle, some local paper, and the woman who was like the bartender at the bowling alley I had dinner with, like at the first night I got there. And what really permeated from a lot of those conversations is just how much at that time the public just accepts that the judges in this town do this. That must be right.
Yes.
Like the guy was like, yeah, no, he would go to the high school the first day of school and say, consider this your warning. If you get in trouble, I'm going to detain you.
Yeah.
Like,
yes.
The woman who served me at that restaurant was like, oh yeah, my brother got detained for smoking cigarettes in school.
Yes.
That's sort of how it is, and I wonder if we're in a different moment, for better or worse, honestly, with like the public perception of these people now, like not a lot of love for government officials, really all the way down now. So I don't know.
I think it's complicated because, so first of all, you're totally right. I mean, I always said that I actually thought, the things that went wrong in Luzerne County also included this sort of complacency from the community, complicity from the prosecutors and the defenders in the courtroom who let it all happen. But yes, the community saw Chivarella as an authority figure that they trusted, and historically trust judges. That's the thing we do in this country. And that's not a bad thing for the most part. We can have another conversation about that. But I think that the willingness to assume that what he's doing must be right, of course, had really profound consequences for kids and families throughout Luzerne County.
I recently caught your acceptance speech. You got a big local Philly award, the Higginbotham Social Justice Champions. You said that, 50 years of work and you're not done yet. You called these dark times and unprecedented, which caught my ear because you lived and worked through a period where we had objectively much more punitive responses to kids. So what is unprecedented here, and what is your view on where we are vis-a-vis that time between, the mid 90s and 2000s, when I think you said there's like 2,000 kids per year tried as adults, something like that.
I think that what feels unprecedented, and I think it is unprecedented, is the fragility of our Constitution. And if we think about the sentencing cases as being a high mark that reversed an extreme low mark in the history of how we treat kids in this country, they succeeded because we had a Supreme Court that was able to and willing to view those extreme sentences of life without parole and the death penalty as violating our Constitution's bar on cruel and unusual punishment. I don't think I'm alone in questioning whether if those same issues came before this court today with a very conservative, 6-member conservative majority, would they be decided the same way? I wouldn't place any bets on that, one way or the other. And to me, the darkness is the uncertainty about where the Supreme Court is headed. The Supreme Court's reversal of Roe versus Wade and Dobbs is just a profound statement about their willingness to undo. And when we are living in a period of undoing, which is what I think we are right now, one needs to feel anxious and one needs to feel worried. I will add, something else that I said at our 50th anniversary party. What I said there was that I thought that an antidote to despair is hope, but that also the antidote to despair is action. And I do think that as we confront this moment, we as advocates need to be creative and energetic about where do we need to pivot, where do we need to change. And so I'm actually very optimistic about the potential before some state Supreme Courts. We have 50 state Supreme Courts in this country. We have 50 state constitutions. Many of them say very much the same thing that our federal Constitution says in terms of individual rights, in terms of the Due Process Clause and Equal Protection Clause, Cruel Punishments Clause. We see that reappear in perhaps slightly different language at the state level, but state Supreme Courts are the final word on what their state constitutions mean. And there has not been a robust effort to test the boundaries and limits of state individual rights and state Supreme Court's willingness to enforce state individual rights, because we haven't had to, because we had a Supreme Court that was ready, willing, and able to do that. We don't have that court today, but we have 50 state Supreme Courts, and I think that's where we need to go.
Do you think about this in the sense of progress or future challenges, or are you more worried that the precedent-setting cases like we've talked about today might come back around and actually get challenged again? Or both, I guess.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I don't think the U.S. Supreme Court, will take up and revisit the death penalty or life without parole. Some people probably are worried about that. I'm not so worried about that right now, but there are a lot of issues around the margins. What if someone doesn't get a formal life without parole sentence, but they get 80 years? And that case goes to the court, and the court says, yeah, we only meant formal because that's a way for them to tweak it. The success of the sentencing cases, particularly, of course, the life without parole decisions in Graham and in Miller, they're only as successful as the parole boards make them. And the parole boards operate in a patchwork fashion. Some are doing their jobs effectively. Some are letting many of the individuals go home. Some are not. If a challenge to a parole board that's pretty much not letting anybody go home gets before the Supreme Court, would the Supreme Court say, not my problem? That's okay. The parole board's doing its work. They get to make that decision. I think that could happen. So as a litigator, as an advocate, my view is stay out of federal court. I don't think there's any upside to being in federal court today in America, because while the district court judges, as we have seen in so many Trump cases, are doing their job, the Supreme Court is reversing them, undoing decisions that they're entering as district court judges and in some cases Court of Appeals judges. So yeah, I think in the near term things will change. The membership on the court will change over time. It could swing back in a different direction. But for the next 5 years, I think we need to be testing state Supreme Courts and trying to hold them accountable to be the protector of individual rights in this country.
Juvenile Law Center today describes its work as reducing the harm of the child welfare and justice systems, limit their reach, and ultimately abolish them so all young people can thrive, which I'm going to guess 5 centuries, 5 decades ago, you would maybe have been surprised that that would be the sort of through line. Now, abolition of child welfare is certainly something that has become, conceptually discussed a lot. I hear that less with juvenile justice, and I'll admit, as a layman, not thinking of it legally or whatever, it's a little hard for me to see that. Like, what would it look like to not have a juvenile justice system? Wouldn't that just mean kids would be exposed to adult systems, or do you guys mean it in a sense of like there'd be no structured government response to?
Actually, neither. One of the things that I've learned, certainly from the individuals who have really written the book about abolition, is that there's a tendency to think about abolition as absence, when in fact it's really about presence. And what that means is that the notion of abolishing something doesn't mean that you leave nothing in its place, but you create something different and something better. And when I think about abolition, which I endorse Juvenile Law Center's commitment to that principle, is really more about radical transformation. We have a system right now, certainly juvenile court and our criminal court, but we'll talk about juvenile court, that is really still steeped in a crime and punishment model. If you do something wrong, it's not just about holding you accountable, it's that you have to be punished. Even if our state juvenile court acts don't say that, that's the culture of America. You do something wrong, you have to be punished. And when we talk about punishment, we talk about mostly carceral punishment, putting kids in something that locks them up or, keeps them secure. They can't get away. That is a model that I believe doesn't work. It's a model that I think has long been broken. And what I would prefer to see, I think what Juvenile Law Center is talking about in putting that in their mission and vision statement, is really about thinking about restoration and healing of individuals, of victims, of communities, and having a response to children who hurt other people, to children who break the law, that is really rooted not in retribution, but in understanding, in rehabilitation, again, in restoration and healing, depending on the particular circumstances, moving away from crime and punishment driving the conversation. And I fully support that.
What sort of line of questioning I like to ask people like you that always annoy people like you is, I think it's always good to have somebody who's got that kind of vision for the future is the right person to ask the really pesky questions about setting the edges of the current system. So I'm going to ask you too, in your opinion, is there any circumstance in your experience representing kids or on a bigger, picture advocating for them, is there any circumstance in the current system today in which you think the juvenile court and the related continuum of services is not equipped to handle a person under 18?
I don't, but it's not just whimsical that I say that. There are countries around the world that confront children who kill other people, who don't try them as adults, who don't send them to prison for decades, who are able to respond to their behavior in a juvenile court-like setting in that particular country and provide the kind of accountability, ensure that kind of accountability and responsibility within a time period that doesn't extend beyond their 18th or 21st birthday. So I can say unequivocally, I don't think that we need to treat kids outside the juvenile court system.
Yeah.
Some kind of juvenile court system. Other people have figured out how to do it.
Do we just lack, in your mind, like creativity and innovation around different forms of accountability? Is that part of the problem here? I mean, when you think of something as carceral, it's because you do something and you get punished at this deep level. And do these countries just have five, six, seven things that exist between arrest and incarceration that we just don't do?
I think that, as I said, I think that the culture of the U.S. is about crime and punishment. I think that when the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When someone breaks the law, we think about, again, punishment and often some kind of institutional, correctional, carceral response. I want to be clear. I think that children who hurt other people should be held responsible for that. You can't live in a civilized society and not impose a level of responsibility for the harm that we as individuals cause, children or adults. But yes, it's a failure of imagination and creativity. We only have one tool in our toolkit.
Meaning incarceration.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so relatedly then, since your view is that we use it too much, what is the appropriate use of incarceration within a juvenile justice context?
I think that I probably would say don't ask that question because it presumes that there will be a moment when it's appropriate. Again, I think that we need to bring more of our intelligence and our imagination and creativity to bear to think about what is the best way and the most appropriate way to hold children responsible, even those who commit the most heinous acts. I don't think we have exhausted the possibilities such that we have to say at some point we have to lock them up. I'm not ready to say that that's true, again, because I do think that there are other parts of the world that can avoid that. I also think that how you think about, I think when we talk about incarceration, we're kind of thinking about like a little prison, right? Like not an adult prison, but a kiddie prison. It doesn't have to be that either, though. Even adult prisons in other parts of the world don't look like our prisons, which of course are often horrific, harmful, abusive environments for the adults who are incarcerated there. I think that we need to be thinking about creating environments that, again, promote healing, promote rehabilitation, ensure that the individual acquires that sense of responsibility for what they've done. Locking people away in cells, when did we decide that was the answer?
Marsha Levick, formerly of Juvenile Law Center, continuing in the field of youth justice and many other issues. Thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you for this conversation.
Thanks to Marsha Levick, co-founder of the Juvenile Law Center, for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Onjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we'd really appreciate it if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow the Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @theimprintnews, and you can visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always get us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.